30 years ago, on the foggy morning of November 15, 1982, Richard Coleman kissed his wife Margaret goodbye at their sprawling Malibu mansion and drove away in his silver Mercedes, never to return home. The 52-year-old real estate mogul had built an empire worth over $20 million, transforming barren California land into luxurious developments that housed Hollywood's elite. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. Margaret Coleman still remembers that morning with crystal clarity, how Richard seemed unusually quiet during breakfast, how he lingered longer than usual at the front door, and how he turned back one last time before disappearing into the morning mist. "He looked at me like he was memorizing my face," she would later tell investigators, her voice breaking with the weight of 3 decades of unanswered questions. The Coleman family's world collapsed that evening when Richard failed to return for their daughter Sarah's birthday dinner. Margaret called his office, then his business partners, then every hotel and restaurant he frequented. Nothing. By midnight, the police were contacted, but the initial response was frustratingly dismissive. "Rich men don't just vanish," Detective Ray Morrison had told Margaret. "Give him a few days. He'll turn up." But Richard Coleman never turned up. His Mercedes was found 3 days later in a Long Beach parking lot, keys still in the ignition, wallet untouched, but no sign of the man himself. The discovery sent shockwaves through Southern California's elite circles. How does a man worth millions simply evaporate into thin air? The investigation that followed was extensive, but ultimately fruitless. Coleman's business dealings were scrutinized, revealing some questionable land acquisitions and partnerships with individuals who had connections to organized crime. There were whispers about unpaid debts, threats from disgruntled investors, and rumors of a secret life that Margaret knew nothing about. Yet despite the suspicions and theories, no concrete evidence emerged. What truly puzzled investigators was what they found in Richard's home office. Hidden in a locked drawer that Margaret didn't even know existed, they discovered a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be the Mojave Desert region. The map was covered in calculations, symbols, and most intriguingly, a set of coordinates written in red ink. 34°44N, 116°25WW. Beside these numbers, in Richard's distinctive handwriting, were the words, "The answer lies where the desert meets the sky." Detective Morrison spent months trying to decode the map's meaning. The coordinates led to a remote area in the Mojave Desert, approximately 200 miles northeast of Los Angeles. Several search teams were dispatched to the location, but they found nothing but sand, rocks, and the occasional cactus. The map was filed away as evidence, becoming another piece of an increasingly complex puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. As the months turned into years, the Coleman case grew cold. Margaret hired private investigators who promised breakthroughs but delivered only expensive disappointments. The family offered rewards that went unclaimed, held press conferences that generated temporary media attention, but no substantial leads. Richard Coleman had become a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered about in Beverly Hills country clubs and Malibu dinner parties. The impact on the Coleman family was devastating. Margaret, once a vibrant socialite who hosted elaborate charity galas, became a recluse, spending her days staring out at the Pacific Ocean, waiting for a husband who would never return. Their daughter Sarah, barely 16 when her father disappeared, struggled through her teenage years without the man who had been her hero and biggest supporter. The family fortune, once growing exponentially under Richard's guidance, slowly dwindled as legal battles over his estate dragged on for years. By the early 1990s, most people had forgotten about Richard Coleman. The case files gathered dust in police archives, the private investigators moved on to other clients, and even the media stopped returning Margaret's calls. It seemed that Richard Coleman had achieved the impossible. He had vanished so completely that even the memory of his disappearance began to fade. But some mysteries refuse to stay buried, and sometimes the answers we seek are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment and the right people to uncover them. For nearly 3 decades, the mysterious map found in Richard Coleman's office remained locked away in Evidence Room 247 of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, a silent witness to a crime that no one could solve. Detective Ray Morrison, who had initially handled the case, retired in 1995, taking with him a nagging sense of failure that he would carry to his grave. "That map haunted me," Morrison would later confess to his replacement. I always felt like it was screaming the answer at us, but we just couldn't hear it. The map itself was a masterpiece of obsessive detail. Richard Coleman had drawn it on expensive cartographic paper, the kind used by professional surveyors and geologists. Every line was precise, every symbol carefully placed. In addition to the prominent coordinates, the map contained dozens of smaller notations, elevation markers, geological symbols, and what appeared to be distance measurements calculated to the exact foot. Margaret Coleman had stared at that map countless times during the investigation. "I used to sneak looks at it when the detectives weren't watching," she revealed years later. "I thought maybe I would see something they missed, some clue that only a wife would understand. But it might as well have been written in a foreign language. Richard never shared his business secrets with me, and apparently he had secrets I never even suspected." What made the map even more intriguing was its age. Forensic analysis revealed that it hadn't been drawn recently before Richard's disappearance. The ink had been applied in layers over several months, possibly even years. This suggested that whatever plan Richard had been formulating, it had been in development for a considerable time. He hadn't suddenly decided to disappear. He had been methodically planning something, and that something was somehow connected to those coordinates in the Mojave Desert. The most puzzling aspect of the map was its accuracy. When investigators cross-referenced Richard's drawings with official geological surveys of the region, they found that his representations were remarkably precise. This level of detail suggested that Richard had either spent considerable time in that area or had access to professional surveying equipment and expertise, yet no one in his circle of friends and business associates could recall him ever expressing interest in desert exploration or geological surveying. Private investigator Helen Vasquez, whom Margaret hired in 1985, spent 2 years studying that map. Richard Coleman was not an outdoorsman, Vasquez noted in her final report. He was a city person, more comfortable in boardrooms than wilderness. Yet this map showed an intimate knowledge of desert terrain that would take years to acquire. It didn't make sense. Vasquez's investigation revealed that Richard had indeed made several unexplained trips to the desert region in the months before his disappearance. Receipts found in his business files showed purchases of camping equipment, geological tools, and even a metal detector. More mysteriously, he had withdrawn large amounts of cash, nearly $200,000 over 6 months, for what he had listed in his ledgers as land acquisition research. The metal detector purchase was particularly puzzling. Why would a real estate developer need such equipment? Margaret was baffled when investigators showed her the receipt. "Richard never mentioned wanting to take up treasure hunting as a hobby," she said. "He barely had time for the hobbies he already had. The idea of him wandering around the desert with a metal detector was ridiculous." But perhaps the most chilling discovery was made by accident. In 1987, while preparing to move Richard's business files to storage, Margaret found a small journal hidden behind other books in his office. The journal, written entirely in Richard's handwriting, contained what appeared to be a record of his desert expeditions. The entries were cryptic and often consisted of single words or short phrases. "Third marker found. Distance confirmed. The arrangement holds." The final entry in the journal was dated just 2 days before Richard's disappearance. It read simply, "Tomorrow changes everything. If something happens to me, follow the coordinates. The truth is buried where X marks the spot." This journal was immediately turned over to police, but by then, the case had already been relegated to the cold case files. The new detective assigned to the case, Maria Santos, reviewed all the evidence, but admitted she was no closer to understanding what had happened to Richard Coleman than her predecessors had been. As the 1990s progressed, the Coleman case became a cautionary tale told in police academies about the dangers of overthinking evidence. Some instructors used the map as an example of how even the most detailed clue could lead nowhere if its context remained unknown. The coordinates had been checked and rechecked, the area had been searched multiple times, and yet the desert had yielded no secrets. But unknown to the investigators, the map was about to find new eyes that would see what law enforcement had missed for 30 years. In the summer of 2012, 30 years after Richard Coleman's disappearance, a group of amateur treasure hunters stumbled upon the case in the most unexpected way. Marcus Rivera, a 34-year-old construction worker from Riverside, had developed an obsession with metal detecting and desert exploration after losing his job during the economic recession. What started as a weekend hobby had evolved into a passion for uncovering California's hidden historical artifacts. Marcus had been researching old mining claims and forgotten settlements in the Mojave Desert when he discovered an online forum post about the Coleman case. A retired detective had shared the story as an example of an unsolved mystery, including a low-resolution image of Richard's mysterious map. The coordinates immediately caught Marcus's attention. They pointed to an area he had been planning to explore for potential mining artifacts. "I wasn't looking to solve a missing person case," Marcus later explained. "I was just curious about what might be buried out there." The idea that a millionaire had marked that exact spot seemed like more than a coincidence. Marcus assembled a team of fellow treasure hunting enthusiasts: Jennifer Walsh, a GPS technology specialist who worked for a surveying company; David Park, a geology student at UC Riverside; and Tom Bradley, a retired Marine with extensive desert survival experience. None of them were professional investigators, but their combined skills in navigation, geology, and terrain exploration would prove invaluable. The team spent weeks researching the Coleman case, obtaining copies of police reports through Freedom of Information requests, and interviewing anyone still alive who had been connected to the original investigation. What they discovered was a case that had been thoroughly investigated, but perhaps not thoroughly understood. The police had treated it like a traditional missing person case, Jennifer observed. They were looking for a body or evidence of foul play. But what if Richard Coleman hadn't been a victim? What if he had been planning something else entirely? Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested to know what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach you. The treasure hunting team's first expedition to the coordinates took place on a scorching Saturday in September 2012. Using professional-grade GPS equipment, they located the exact spot indicated on Richard's map, a seemingly unremarkable patch of desert approximately 3 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by Joshua trees and scattered boulders. At first glance, the location appeared to offer nothing of interest. The desert landscape looked untouched by human activity, with no visible signs that anyone had ever been there. But David Park's geological training proved crucial in identifying subtle anomalies in the terrain that a casual observer might miss. The rock formations didn't look natural, David noted in his expedition log. There were several large boulders arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, almost like a compass rose. It was subtle, but once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. Using metal detectors, the team began systematically scanning the area around the boulder formation. For the first few hours, they found nothing but the usual desert debris: old cans, bottle caps, and fragments of metal that had been weathered beyond recognition. But just as they were preparing to expand their search radius, Marcus's metal detector began emitting the strong, consistent signal that every treasure hunter dreams of hearing. The signal was coming from beneath a flat sandstone rock that sat at the center of the boulder formation. When they moved the rock, which required all 4 team members working together, they revealed a shallow depression in the desert floor. Someone had deliberately placed that rock there, and recently enough that the depression hadn't been filled in by wind-blown sand. Beneath the rock, buried just 18 inches below the surface, they found a metal box. It was a military surplus ammunition container, sealed with waterproof tape and wrapped in heavy plastic. The container was heavy, much heavier than its size would suggest, and when they opened it, the team found something that would change their weekend treasure hunt into a criminal investigation. Inside the box were stacks of $100 bills, bound with rubber bands and wrapped in plastic. A quick count revealed nearly $75,000 in cash. But more importantly, beneath the money, they found documents, land deeds, business contracts, and a letter addressed to whoever finds this first. The letter was written in Richard Coleman's distinctive handwriting and dated November 13, 1982, just 2 days before his disappearance. It began with the words that would send chills down the spines of everyone who read it. If you are reading this, then my plan has either succeeded completely or failed catastrophically. Either way, I am probably dead. The team immediately contacted the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and within hours, the quiet desert location became a crime scene once again. Detective Carlos Mendoza, who had recently been assigned to the cold case unit, arrived with a full forensics team and the realization that the Coleman case was about to be reopened in the most dramatic way possible. As the sun set over the Mojave Desert that evening, It illuminated not just another day's end, but the beginning of the final chapter in a mystery that had haunted Southern California for 3 decades. Detective Carlos Mendoza had seen his share of cold cases come back to life, but nothing had prepared him for the contents of Richard Coleman's letter. As he read the document under the harsh lights of the police mobile command unit, the mystery that had puzzled investigators for 30 years began to unravel in ways no one had anticipated. The letter, written in Richard's precise handwriting on his personal stationery, revealed a man who had been living in fear for months before his disappearance. But it wasn't fear of random violence or business competitors that had driven him to create such an elaborate contingency plan. It was fear of his own business partner. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then Vincent Torino has probably made good on his threats. I have suspected for months that Vincent has been planning to eliminate me and take control of our joint ventures. What he doesn't know is that I have been planning my own survival strategy." Vincent Torino had been Richard Coleman's business partner for over a decade, a relationship that had made both men extremely wealthy. Together they had acquired and developed some of the most valuable real estate in Southern California, transforming empty lots into luxury developments that catered to Hollywood's elite. To the outside world, they had appeared to be not just business partners, but close friends. Detective Mendoza immediately pulled Vincent Torino's file from the original investigation. In 1982, Torino had been questioned extensively about Richard's disappearance, but his alibi had been solid. On the day Richard vanished, Vincent had been in New York attending a real estate conference with over 200 witnesses. He had even called Richard's office from his hotel room, leaving a message that was recorded by Richard's secretary. But according to Richard's letter, Vincent's travel schedule had been part of an elaborate setup designed to provide him with the perfect alibi, while hired professionals carried out the actual crime. "Vincent is too smart to get his own hands dirty," Richard had written. "But I have discovered he has connections to people who specialize in making problems disappear." The letter went on to detail Richard's discovery of financial irregularities in their joint accounts. Over several months, Richard had noticed that funds were being diverted from their shared projects into accounts he couldn't access. When he confronted Vincent about the discrepancies, his partner had become evasive and eventually threatening. "Vincent told me that I was asking too many questions about things that weren't my concern," the letter continued. "When I insisted on bringing in an independent auditor, he made it clear that such action would be very dangerous for my health and the safety of my family." Richard's response to these threats had been to begin secretly liquidating his assets and creating multiple contingency plans. The cash buried in the desert was only part of a larger strategy designed to ensure his family's financial security if something happened to him. But more importantly, Richard had been gathering evidence of Vincent's criminal activities, evidence that was also hidden in the desert location. "I have documented everything," Richard wrote. "Financial records, recorded conversations, photographs of Vincent meeting with known criminals. If something happens to me, this evidence will prove that Vincent Torino is not just a thief, but a murderer." Detective Mendoza realized that the ammunition box they had found was likely just the first of several caches Richard had created. The map in Richard's office hadn't been marking a single location. It had been a treasure map leading to multiple hiding spots throughout the desert region. The investigation team returned to the site the next morning with ground-penetrating radar and a larger crew of forensic specialists. Using Richard's map as a guide, they began searching for other buried containers in the surrounding area. The systematic search revealed the full scope of Richard Coleman's desperate preparation. Over 3 days, they uncovered 4 more buried caches, each containing different types of evidence. One container held financial records documenting Vincent Torino's embezzlement of nearly $2 million from their joint accounts. Another contained photographs of Vincent meeting with known associates of the Colombo crime family, taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. The most damaging evidence was found in the third container, audio recordings of conversations between Vincent and a man identified as Anthony "Tony the Fish" Marconi, a known enforcer for organized crime. In these recordings, Vincent could be clearly heard discussing the Coleman problem and agreeing to pay $50,000 for a permanent solution. But it was the fourth and final container that provided the most shocking revelation of all. Along with additional financial records, this cache contained a handwritten confession from Richard Coleman himself, detailing not just Vincent's crimes, but his own involvement in money laundering operations that had been funding organized crime activities for years. "I am not an innocent victim," Richard had written in this final confession. "I became involved with dangerous people because of greed, and now that greed has put my family at risk. Vincent was supposed to be my protection from these people, but he has decided it's more profitable to eliminate me and take control of the entire operation himself." The confession revealed that Richard had been planning to disappear voluntarily, hoping to escape both Vincent's threats and the criminal organization that had become increasingly demanding of their services. The elaborate burial system was designed to provide evidence against Vincent, while also giving Richard's family access to clean money that couldn't be traced back to their illegal activities. As Detective Mendoza pieced together the evidence, a picture emerged of two men who had become trapped in a web of their own criminal creation, with one trying to escape and the other determined to silence him permanently. But one crucial question remained unanswered. If Richard Coleman had successfully executed his disappearance plan, where was he now? And if he had been murdered as he suspected, where was his body? The answer to that question would prove to be more shocking than anything the investigation had revealed so far. Vincent Torino was 73 years old when Detective Mendoza knocked on the door of his Beverly Hills mansion on a crisp October morning in 2012. 30 years had passed since Richard Coleman's disappearance, and Vincent had spent those decades building his reputation as one of Southern California's most successful real estate developers. He had married twice, raised 3 children, and donated millions to charity. To the outside world, he was a pillar of the community, but the evidence hidden in the Mojave Desert was about to destroy the life Vincent had carefully constructed on the foundation of his former partner's disappearance. When Detective Mendoza presented Vincent with the search warrant, the elderly man's reaction was telling. Instead of confusion or curiosity about why police were interested in him after so many years, Vincent immediately asked for his attorney. It was the reaction of a man who had been expecting this moment for 3 decades. "Mr. Torino," Detective Mendoza said as they sat in Vincent's opulent living room, surrounded by original artwork and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, "we need to discuss your relationship with Richard Coleman." Vincent's attorney, Martin Goldberg, one of Los Angeles' most expensive criminal defense lawyers, advised his client to remain silent. But the weight of carrying a secret for 30 years had taken its toll on Vincent Torino, and when confronted with the evidence from Richard's desert cache, his carefully maintained composure began to crack. The audio recordings were particularly devastating. When Detective Mendoza played the tape of Vincent discussing the Coleman problem with Tony Marconi, Vincent's face went pale. The recordings were clear enough that voice analysis would easily confirm his identity, and the content was damning enough to support charges of conspiracy to commit murder. But Vincent's reaction to hearing his own voice plotting Richard's death was not what investigators expected. Instead of denial or anger, Vincent began to laugh, a bitter, hollow sound that filled the quiet room with an unsettling energy. "You think you've solved it," Vincent said, ignoring his lawyer's frantic gestures to remain silent. "You think you've figured out what happened to Richard Coleman, but you have no idea how wrong you are." Detective Mendoza leaned forward, recognizing the moment when a decades-old secret was about to be revealed. "Tell me what really happened, Vincent." What Vincent Torino revealed next would fundamentally change everything investigators thought they knew about the Coleman case. According to Vincent, Richard Coleman had indeed been planning to disappear, but not because he was running from Vincent's threats. Richard had been running from the FBI. "Richard came to me in September of 1982, Vincent explained, his voice growing stronger as he prepared to unburden himself of a secret he had carried for 30 years. "He told me that federal agents had approached him, that they knew about our money laundering operations, and that they wanted him to become an informant." The money laundering allegations in Richard's confession had been accurate, but according to Vincent, the scale was much larger than even Richard's hidden documents had revealed. Their real estate empire had been built on laundering money for multiple criminal organizations, not just the Colombo family. Over the course of a decade, they had processed nearly $50 million in illegal funds through fake property transactions and development projects. "Richard was terrified," Vincent continued. He said the FBI had enough evidence to put us both away for life, but they were offering him immunity in exchange for cooperation. The problem was, if word got out that Richard was talking to federal agents, we would both be dead within a week. According to Vincent's account, the recorded conversations with Tony Marconi had not been about arranging Richard's murder, but about arranging his fake death. Tony Marconi, despite his reputation as an enforcer, also provided specialized services for people who needed to disappear permanently. For the right price, he could create untraceable new identities and help his clients vanish without leaving any evidence behind. Richard's plan was brilliant, Vincent admitted. He would stage his own disappearance in such a way that everyone, the FBI, the crime families, even his own family, would believe he was dead. Meanwhile, he would be living under a new identity, probably in another country, with enough hidden money to live comfortably for the rest of his life. The elaborate burial system in the desert had served multiple purposes in this scenario. The evidence against Vincent was insurance, designed to keep Vincent from revealing Richard's survival to their criminal associates. If Vincent ever tried to expose Richard's fake death, the buried evidence would destroy him. At the same time, the cash and clean financial records would eventually provide for Margaret and Sarah Coleman's future, once enough time had passed to make the money untraceable. But something went wrong, Vincent said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Richard was supposed to contact me after he was safely established in his new life. We had agreed on a signal, a way for him to let me know that his plan had succeeded. That signal never came. Detective Mendoza realized that Vincent Torino's story, if true, meant that the Coleman case wasn't a murder investigation at all. It was a missing person case where the missing person had deliberately engineered his own disappearance, but something had gone wrong with his escape plan. The question now was whether Richard Coleman was living under a false identity somewhere in the world, or whether his elaborate disappearance plan had indeed ended in his death, just not in the way anyone had suspected. If this case has already hooked you, leave a like. It helps Richard Coleman's story reach more people. Vincent Torino's revelations sent the investigation in an entirely new direction, but Detective Mendoza wasn't ready to take the elderly man's word without independent verification. If Richard Coleman had indeed faked his own death with Vincent's help, there should be evidence of the elaborate planning required for such an operation. More importantly, if Richard was still alive somewhere, there should be financial traces of his new existence. The detective assembled a team of financial forensic specialists and began the painstaking process of tracing every dollar that had moved through Richard Coleman's accounts in the months before his disappearance. What they discovered was a masterclass in financial misdirection that had been decades ahead of its time. Starting in July 1982, Richard had begun liquidating assets in small amounts designed to avoid triggering reporting requirements. He sold stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings through multiple brokers and investment firms, always keeping individual transactions below the thresholds that would generate government paperwork. The money from these sales was then moved through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts before disappearing entirely from traditional banking systems. Richard Coleman was laundering his own money, explained FBI financial crimes specialist Agent Sarah Chen, who had been brought into the investigation. He was using the same techniques he had perfected for his criminal clients to hide his own assets from both law enforcement and his business partners. The total amount Richard had successfully moved out of traceable accounts was staggering. Nearly $8 million had vanished from the financial system between July and November 1982. This was money that existed on paper, but couldn't be located by any government agency or financial institution. But the most significant discovery came when investigators expanded their search beyond traditional banking records. In 1982, the modern digital financial system was still in its infancy, but Richard Coleman had been one of the early adopters of emerging technologies that would later become commonplace. Working with computer forensic specialists from the FBI's cybercrimes unit, the team discovered that Richard had been one of the first individuals to move large amounts of money through what would later become known as cryptocurrency-like systems. In 1982, these were primitive networks used primarily by academic institutions and government agencies, but Richard had found ways to exploit them for moving untraceable funds. He was essentially creating Bitcoin before Bitcoin existed, Agent Chen explained. Richard Coleman was using university computer networks and early commercial systems to move money in ways that left almost no paper trail. The investigation team also discovered that Richard's preparations had extended far beyond financial arrangements. In the months before his disappearance, he had been systematically establishing elements of a new identity. Using his real estate connections, he had acquired properties in remote locations under false names, purchased vehicles with untraceable registrations, and even arranged for medical and dental records to be altered or destroyed. Most significantly, investigators found evidence that Richard had been working with a professional identity creation service operated by former intelligence agency personnel. These were people who specialized in helping clients disappear completely, and their services were primarily used by individuals fleeing organized crime or government prosecution. The evidence strongly supported Vincent Torino's claim that Richard had been planning a voluntary disappearance, but it also raised new questions about what had gone wrong with his plan. If Richard had been so meticulous in his preparations, why hadn't he succeeded in contacting Vincent after his escape? And why had no trace of his new identity ever surfaced in 30 years of investigation? The answer came from an unexpected source: Tony Marconi himself. By 2012, Anthony Marconi was 67 years old and serving a life sentence in federal prison for racketeering charges unrelated to the Coleman case. When Detective Mendoza approached him about the 1982 recordings, Marconi initially refused to cooperate, but when presented with evidence that could potentially add murder conspiracy charges to his existing sentence, the aging criminal decided that cooperation was his best option. "I never killed Richard Coleman," Marconi insisted during his first interview with investigators. "Vincent Torino paid me to help Richard disappear, not to eliminate him." The plan was supposed to be foolproof, but Coleman got greedy and stupid at the last minute. According to Marconi, Richard's disappearance plan had been executed exactly as designed. On November 15, 1982, Richard had driven his Mercedes to the predetermined location in Long Beach, where Marconi's associates were waiting. They had then transported Richard to a safe house while making it appear that he had vanished from the parking lot. "Coleman was supposed to lay low for 6 months while we finalized his new identity documents," Marconi explained. "After that, he would be relocated to a property we had arranged in Costa Rica, and he could live out his life as a different person." But according to Marconi, Richard had become impatient with the process. After only 3 weeks in hiding, he had begun making unauthorized contact with people from his old life, trying to arrange additional financial transfers and check on his family's welfare. These contacts had compromised the entire operation. "The man was a control freak," Marconi said. "He couldn't stand not knowing what was happening with his business and his family. Every time he made an unauthorized phone call or tried to move money, he was creating traces that could be followed back to us." The situation had come to a head in early December 1982, when Richard had attempted to make direct contact with his wife, Margaret. According to Marconi, Richard had driven to Malibu and was watching his house from a distance when he was spotted by associates of one of the crime families they had been laundering money for. These people had been watching the Coleman house for weeks, hoping Richard would eventually show up, Marconi explained. When he did, they grabbed him. That was the last anyone heard from Richard Coleman. If Marconi's story was accurate, then Richard Coleman had indeed succeeded in faking his own disappearance, only to be killed a few weeks later by the very criminals he had been trying to escape. His elaborate plan had failed, not because of poor execution, but because he couldn't resist the temptation to maintain contact with his old life. But Detective Mendoza still had one more lead to pursue, one that would finally provide the answer to the question that had haunted the Coleman family for 30 years. What had actually happened to Richard Coleman? As 2012 drew to a close, Detective Mendoza found himself with more pieces of the Richard Coleman puzzle than any investigator before him, but still lacking the final proof that would definitively solve the case. Vincent Torino's confession and Tony Marconi's testimony had provided a coherent narrative of what had happened, but without physical evidence, the case remained technically unsolved. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Richard Coleman's own meticulous planning. While reviewing the evidence found in the desert caches for the dozenth time, FBI forensic accountant Linda Martinez noticed something that previous investigators had overlooked. Hidden in the margin of one of Richard's financial documents was a series of numbers that appeared to be another set of coordinates. Unlike the prominent coordinates that had led to the buried evidence, these numbers were written in faint pencil and partially obscured by other notations. It was only when Martinez held the document under a specific type of forensic lighting that the numbers became clearly visible. 34 degree 52 N, 117 and D 18 W. Richard Coleman was a belt and suspenders kind of guy, Detective Mendoza observed. If he was planning for every contingency, he would have created multiple backup plans. These coordinates might lead to something even more important than what we've already found. The new coordinates pointed to a location approximately 40 miles northeast of the original desert site, in an even more remote area of the Mojave Desert near the town of Barstow. Unlike the first location, which had been relatively accessible, this site was in rugged terrain that would require specialized equipment to reach. The investigation team, now expanded to include FBI agents and California State Police officers, organized a major expedition to the site in January 2013. Using helicopters and all-terrain vehicles, they reached the coordinates on a cold, clear morning that offered unlimited visibility across the stark desert landscape. What they found at the second site was immediately recognizable as different from the first. Instead of carefully arranged boulders marking buried caches, this location contained the remnants of what appeared to be a camp or temporary shelter. Scattered among the Joshua trees were pieces of metal, fragments of canvas, and other debris that had been weathered by 30 years of desert sun and wind. Ground-penetrating radar revealed several anomalies beneath the surface, but these were larger and deeper than the ammunition boxes found at the first site. When the excavation team began digging, they immediately realized they were uncovering something far more significant than hidden documents or buried cache. At a depth of 4 feet, they found the first human remains. The skeleton was incomplete, scattered by decades of desert scavengers and weather, but enough remained to make preliminary identifications. The remains were those of an adult male, approximately 50-60 years old, who had been buried hastily in a shallow grave. More importantly, mixed in with the bones were personal items that began to tell a story. A gold wedding ring engraved with the initials RC and MC, and a Rolex watch that Margaret Coleman immediately identified as the one she had given Richard for their 15th wedding anniversary. But the most significant discovery was yet to come. Buried near the skeletal remains, investigators found a metal box similar to those discovered at the first site, but this one contained Richard Coleman's final message, a message he had apparently written while being held captive by his killers. The letter, scrawled in shaky handwriting on pages torn from a small notebook, was dated December 8, 1982, nearly 3 weeks after Richard's disappearance. It was addressed to Margaret and began with the words that would finally provide closure to 30 years of uncertainty. "My darling Margaret, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come true." In the letter, Richard confirmed much of what Vincent Torino and Tony Marconi had already revealed about his disappearance plan, but he also provided details that only he could have known. He described being held in a remote desert location by associates of the Gambino crime family, who had discovered his plan to cooperate with federal investigators. "They found out about the FBI," Richard wrote. "Vincent's contacts in law enforcement told him that I was going to testify against our money laundering operations. The crime families decided that I knew too much about their operations to be allowed to live, even in hiding. Richard's captors had apparently allowed him to write the letter as part of their psychological torture, believing that it would never be found. They had forced him to reveal the locations of all his hidden assets and had tortured him for information about other people involved in their money laundering network. I am writing this knowing that I will not live to see tomorrow," Richard's final letter continued, "but I want you to know that every decision I made was an attempt to protect you and Sarah from the consequences of my own greed and poor judgment. I hope that someday you can forgive me for the choices that led to this moment." The letter ended with specific instructions for accessing offshore accounts that contained clean money Richard had set aside for his family's future, money that had never been connected to criminal activities. It also contained apologies to business associates and friends who had been hurt by his disappearance, and expressions of regret for the criminal activities that had ultimately led to his death. Forensic analysis of the handwriting confirmed that the letter had indeed been written by Richard Coleman, and carbon dating of the paper and ink supported the December 1982 date. More importantly, the location of the remains and the circumstances of their burial supported the narrative that Richard had been murdered by organized crime associates shortly after his failed disappearance attempt. DNA testing of the skeletal remains provided final confirmation. The bones found in the Mojave Desert belonged to Richard Coleman. After 30 years of uncertainty, the Coleman family finally had definitive proof of what had happened to their husband and father. But the discovery also revealed that Richard Coleman's story was more complex than anyone had imagined. He had been neither a complete victim nor a complete villain, but rather a man whose moral compromises had ultimately led to his destruction, even as he tried desperately to protect the people he loved most. The discovery of Richard Coleman's remains and his final letter sent shockwaves through Southern California's law enforcement and business communities. The evidence found at the second desert site didn't just solve a 30-year-old missing person case. It exposed a criminal network that had been operating for decades and implicated individuals who had built seemingly respectable lives on the foundation of Richard's death. Detective Mendoza found himself at the center of what would become one of the largest organized crime investigations in California's history. Richard's final letter had included names, dates, and specific details about money laundering operations that extended far beyond his partnership with Vincent Torino. The FBI immediately launched a joint task force that would eventually involve agents from 3 states and multiple federal agencies. The first major arrest came just 2 weeks after the discovery of Richard's remains. Vincent Torino, despite his cooperation with the investigation, was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and accessory to murder after the fact. At 73 years old, facing the prospect of dying in federal prison, Vincent made a decision that would implicate dozens of other individuals in criminal activities spanning 3 decades. Vincent Torino sang like a canary, FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen later recalled. Once he realized he was facing life in prison, he decided that his best chance for any kind of mercy was complete cooperation. The information he provided led to investigations that would continue for years. Vincent's detailed testimony revealed that the Coleman-Torino money laundering operation had been just one node in a vast network that included real estate developers, bank officials, casino operators, and legitimate businesses throughout the Southwest. Over 2 decades, the network had processed hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal funds, transforming drug money and racketeering profits into seemingly legitimate investments. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Richard Coleman's meticulous record-keeping, combined with Vincent's testimony, provided investigators with a roadmap to criminal activities that stretched from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, from Phoenix to San Diego. Bank accounts were frozen, properties were seized, and grand juries were convened in multiple jurisdictions. Among those indicted were several prominent figures in Southern California society. Thomas Hendricks, a bank vice president who had facilitated illegal transfers for 20 years, was arrested at his Beverly Hills country club. Maria Santos, a casino executive in Las Vegas, was taken into custody while attending her daughter's wedding. Dr. Raymond Walsh, a respected surgeon who had invested laundered money in medical facilities, was charged while performing surgery and had to be escorted from the operating room in handcuffs. But the most shocking arrest was yet to come. Following leads provided by Vincent Torino and corroborated by Richard's hidden documents, investigators discovered that the criminal network had included a highly placed official within the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department itself. Deputy Chief Robert Morrison, the nephew of the original detective who had investigated Richard's disappearance, had been providing inside information to criminal associates for over 15 years. The revelation that law enforcement corruption had compromised the original Coleman investigation explained many of the puzzling aspects of the case. Robert Morrison had used his position to misdirect the investigation, ensuring that certain leads were never pursued and that specific individuals were never questioned. He had also provided advance warning to criminal associates when law enforcement operations might threaten their activities. "It was a betrayal of everything we stand for," Sheriff James Patterson said during a press conference announcing Morrison's arrest. "The fact that corruption within our own department may have prevented us from solving this case 30 years ago is something we will have to live with forever." The investigation also revealed the full extent of the violence that had surrounded Richard Coleman's death. According to testimony from several cooperating witnesses, Richard had not been the only person killed for threatening the money laundering network. Over the years, at least 6 other individuals had been murdered for asking too many questions, becoming too greedy, or threatening to cooperate with law enforcement. These additional victims included a bank auditor who had discovered suspicious transactions in 1985, a real estate appraiser who had refused to inflate property values in 1989, and a casino accountant who had threatened to expose illegal activities in 1994. In each case, the murders had been disguised as accidents, suicides, or random crimes, and the investigations had been subtly misdirected by corrupted law enforcement officials. Tony Marconi, facing additional murder charges based on the expanding investigation, provided details about the organization's methods that painted a picture of a criminal enterprise that had operated with near impunity for decades. The group had maintained detailed records of their activities, operated sophisticated communication networks, and had contingency plans for dealing with law enforcement pressure. These weren't street criminals, FBI agent Chen explained. This was organized crime at its most sophisticated level. They had lawyers, accountants, politicians, and law enforcement officials on their payroll. They operated legitimate businesses as fronts and had established relationships with criminal organizations across the country. The network's reach extended beyond California's borders. Investigators discovered connections to money laundering operations in Nevada, Arizona, Florida, and New York. International connections included banks in the Cayman Islands, shell companies in Panama, and real estate investments in Costa Rica, the same country where Richard Coleman had planned to live under his new identity. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that Richard Coleman's murder had been just one incident in a decades-long criminal enterprise that had generated billions of dollars in illegal profits. The discovery of his remains had opened a door that law enforcement had been trying to find for 30 years, providing the evidence needed to dismantle one of the most successful criminal organizations in American history. But for the Coleman family, the expanding investigation brought both closure and new pain. Margaret Coleman, now 74 years old, finally had answers about her husband's fate, but those answers revealed that the man she had mourned for 30 years had been deeply involved in criminal activities she had never suspected. 5 years after treasure hunters discovered the first buried cache in the Mojave Desert, the final chapter of the Richard Coleman case was written in federal courtrooms across 3 states. By 2017, the investigation had resulted in 47 indictments, 32 convictions, and the seizure of over $200 million in assets connected to the criminal network that had operated for nearly 4 decades. Margaret Coleman sat in the front row of the Los Angeles Federal Courthouse on the day Vincent Torino received his sentence. At 78 years old, Richard's former business partner had become a frail shadow of the powerful man who had once controlled millions of dollars in real estate developments. His cooperation with investigators had earned him a reduced sentence of 15 years in federal prison, but everyone in the courtroom knew he would likely die behind bars. Mrs. Coleman, Judge Patricia Williams said before pronouncing sentence, "I want you to know that while nothing can bring back your husband or erase the pain your family has endured, the truth about his death has helped ensure that the people responsible for his murder and for the deaths of many others have finally been brought to justice." Margaret Coleman had chosen not to make a victim impact statement, but her presence in the courtroom spoke volumes about the dignity with which she had handled 35 years of uncertainty and grief. When asked later by reporters how she felt about finally learning the truth, her response was simple: "I'm grateful to know what happened to Richard, but I'm heartbroken to learn who he really was." The woman who had spent decades believing her husband was an innocent victim of random violence had been forced to confront the reality that Richard Coleman had been an active participant in criminal activities that had funded organized crime for years. The clean money he had set aside for his family's future could never compensate for the moral compromises that had ultimately led to his death. Sarah Coleman, now 51 years old and a successful attorney in her own right, had taken a more philosophical view of her father's legacy. "My father made terrible choices that hurt a lot of people," she said in a statement released through her law firm. "But he also tried in his final weeks to protect his family and provide evidence that would eventually bring justice to his killers. I choose to remember both the man who made mistakes and the man who tried to make amends." The treasure hunting team that had started the entire investigation by following Richard's mysterious coordinates had been forever changed by their discovery. Marcus Rivera used his share of the reward money to start a legitimate archaeological consulting business. Jennifer Walsh became a consultant to law enforcement agencies on the use of GPS technology in cold case investigations. David Park completed his geology degree and joined the FBI's Forensic Science Division. Tom Bradley returned to his quiet retirement, but not before writing a book about their desert discovery that became a bestseller. The impact of the Coleman case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The investigation had exposed systemic corruption within multiple law enforcement agencies and had led to reforms in how missing person cases were handled. The revelation that financial records and physical evidence could remain hidden but recoverable for decades changed how investigators approached cold cases. Law enforcement agencies across the country began implementing new protocols for documenting and preserving evidence, recognizing that cases considered permanently unsolved might eventually be reopened with new technology and investigative techniques. The Coleman case became a textbook example of how patient, methodical investigation, combined with technological advances, could solve even the most complex cold cases. The money laundering techniques pioneered by Richard Coleman and Vincent Torino had also provided valuable intelligence about early forms of financial crime that would later evolve into modern cybercriminal activities. The investigation helped federal agencies understand how criminal organizations had adapted to technological changes and had influenced the development of new laws governing financial crimes. Perhaps most importantly, the case had demonstrated the power of ordinary citizens to impact major criminal investigations. The treasure hunters who had followed Richard's coordinates had succeeded where decades of professional law enforcement had failed, proving that sometimes fresh eyes and unconventional approaches could unlock mysteries that traditional methods couldn't solve. Tony Marconi, the aging enforcer whose testimony had been crucial to understanding Richard's final weeks, died in federal prison in 2016, just 2 years before the final convictions were handed down. In his last interview with investigators, he had expressed something resembling remorse for his role in Richard's death. Coleman was a greedy man who got involved with dangerous people, Marconi had said, but he didn't deserve to die the way he did. Nobody deserves that. I'm glad the truth finally came out, even if it took 30 years. As the legal proceedings concluded and the last appeals were exhausted, the Mojave Desert returned to its eternal silence. The coordinates that Richard Coleman had marked on his mysterious map had finally yielded all their secrets, but the landscape itself remained unchanged, a testament to the permanence of the natural world and the transience of human ambition. The Coleman case had begun with a man's desperate attempt to escape the consequences of his own choices, and it had ended with justice for not just Richard, but for all the victims of the criminal network he had helped create. The treasure map he had drawn in his final desperate months had become a roadmap to truth, leading investigators through a maze of corruption, violence, and betrayal to a conclusion that no one could have predicted. In the end, Richard Coleman's legacy was neither purely that of victim nor villain, but of a complex human being whose moral failures had ultimately contributed to exposing a criminal enterprise that had operated in the shadows for decades. His death had been tragic and unnecessary, but the evidence he had left behind had ensured that his killers and their associates would eventually face justice. The mystery of the millionaire who disappeared after leaving only a map with coordinates had been solved, but its resolution had revealed truths far more complex and disturbing than anyone had imagined possible. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Richard Coleman's story. See you in the next video. In the vast expanse of the Mojave Desert, where Richard Coleman's remains were finally discovered, the harsh landscape keeps its secrets until someone knows exactly where to look. His story reminds us that the truth, like buried treasure, may remain hidden for decades, but with persistence, courage, and sometimes a stroke of fortune, even the deepest mysteries can eventually be brought to light.